Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julie Mulvihill, and I am the Executive Director of Humanities Kansas. Welcome to the Big Idea. We are excited to have you here today. If you're new to the Big Idea, just know that this is a monthly online program where we explore new and fresh perspective in the humanities and in humanities work. And you are not going to be disappointed today. We have a terrific lineup. Now, today is something special. It's part three of our three-part series this fall, looking at museums as storytellers. Whose stories get told and how are they told? And how do we find out these stories and all of that good stuff? And so I think you're in for just a terrific conversation. Now, just a reminder, the big idea begins with a written article or an essay, some sort of piece. We're going to put that in the chat box in case you didn't have a chance to read that in advance. And from there, we get to talk with our two special guests who will explore that theme in more specifics. Our hope is that you take this big idea and share it with your friends and your family over lunch or dinner or a walk in the park and help join that movement of ideas that's happening across our state. We welcome your questions. You can put them in the chat box so you can interact with one another. You can put them in the Q&A and we'll put those forward to our guests as we come. Now, to start us off, I want to introduce our host, Dr. Valerie Mendoza. She's a Topeka native. She's a historian, received her PhD in history from the University of California, Berkeley. She works in the public humanities. I'm going to bet that many of you have met her or worked with her. She has an area of expertise in Latino history in the Midwest, and so you see a lot of her research and work on that around. We've been lucky to have her work with us here at Humanities Kansas. She's also been a consultant at the Historical Society, the Kansas Arts Commission, and the National Folklife Network. So, Valerie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie. And thank you all for being here. And I would like to welcome Dr. Sarah Bell, who is the director of the Museum and Education Division at the Kansas Historical Society. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Kansas. And Donna Rae Pearson, who is a museum specialist for the Kansas Historical Society and holds a master's degree in history from Wichita. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna so many directions we can go. But Donna Rae, I'm gonna start with you. And something that you said in the Big Idea essay. You said if I read a story about a man, I ask myself, well, was there a woman around, an African American? And then I look for the stories. And I love that because, I think lots of times we just take stories that we hear, we see at face value. Oftentimes they're from the point of view of a man. And then, we don't really think beyond, what we're reading or what we're viewing. So can you give us an example of a time where you did that? You saw this male-dominated story and you're like, who else is there? You're muted, Donna Rae.
Sorry about that. Yeah, there's quite a few of them. I think I have two favorite ones right now that I've done over the past couple of years, and I'll try to go through them quickly. We've all heard of the Phelps family and thinking about LGBTQ issues. So the museum acquired Gilbert Baker's flag. He actually designed the pride flag. But I wanted to go a little bit deeper. And again, who else is on the scene talking about things like this? So that led me to Stephanie Mott. She was an activist here in Topeka. But then I ended up in Wichita following her story. Wichita State University has now renamed an award that was for Harvey Milk after Stephanie Mott as an activist. But what I got from that is they also hold lavender graduations, and that is something that's kind of relatively new on the scene. So I got some cords and some other things from their lavender graduations. So that's one story. Another one that I really like, it's not women centered, but it is African American centered. We really don't think about Black people being abolitionists, especially during that era. So we all maybe know the story of William Matthews. He was one of the first officers in a colored regiment in Kansas. But really digging into his story a little bit more, he actually came here before the Civil War and started working on issues related to Blacks in Kansas, and was an abolitionist even before, he just doesn't get credit to being an abolitionist. So I also like to highlight his story. He really did a lot of work in the Leavenworth area. And so, yeah, I think those are two decent examples, but if you want more, I can keep going. No.
I think we'd all love to hear about more and more stories. And for those of you who don't know, Lavender graduation is graduation for special graduation ceremonies for LGBTQ students and their families. So, yeah, thank you for those two really great examples. That's definitely a way to get this going. Kind of playing off of that, Sarah, you talk about how stories of the enslaved have been lost, right? And so, how have you all worked to elevate the stories of African Americans in Kansas, and specifically Black women? And can you give us an example of how you've gone on about this?
Sure. Just I, Donna Rae and I'm so glad we're here doing this for you all, but it's just, this is like a little bit of what our conversations are in the office all the time. So it's fun to get to share this for a wider audience, because we were just talking about William Matthews in particular and how his story is threaded through and shows up so many times and will show up so many times in the new museum gallery within the story of Bleeding Kansas. And it's just one of those examples of how with what we're doing this time around, really pulling forward these people's stories and showing the complexities that the folks who lived here, especially in that territorial era, had. And so William Matthews is one of our featured abolitionists, but you'll continue to meet him throughout. So it's a great example. But in terms of Black women in particular, one story we're really excited to share in the new gallery is the story of Nicodemus. And we are doing this with a dugout that we are constructing in the new space. And it's a little teaser for you all with what is to come. And so before, as we were going through this process and deciding on this story, of course, we wanted to make sure we were meeting with and talking with Angela Bates, who I believe is now the retired director of the Nicodemus Historical Society, but certainly expert in this story. And so Angela came out here, I think it was over the summer, and we got to meet with her and we were sharing what our intentions were of this story and the space. And she got really excited at one point and said that she felt like what she needed to do was donate 2 hurricane lamps to the museum. These were brought by her ancestors from Kentucky when they did this journey to Nicodemus, and that she just felt like they belonged in the museum. And we, of course, were very excited about this offer. And I think it was the following Friday, Donna Rae drove out there to get them, didn't sleep on it. And so we have these now in our collection and they will be on display. And what is great about this is because we were going to do the story regardless. We don't have, sadly, a lot of material culture in our collection related to particularly early African American history in Kansas. And yet we're telling the story how we can through images, through the stories we do have. So having these 2 items and this hurricane lamp, the one in particular is just so strikingly beautiful. It really elevates the story to the next level because of the material culture we now have, thanks to Angela. So that is one way we get to, through this recent acquisition, get to tell the story. And then the other one I'll share is this is also a personal connection from just myself as a scholar, but I've been studying women's suffrage in Kansas now for almost a decade and gotten to do a lot of talks through Humanities Kansas about this topic. And particularly back in 2020, and with the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, there was a lot of discussion about how we're talking about women's suffrage, and that it is a story that is so often dominated by white voices. And so within the presentations that I did in my research, I really made sure to bring forward two women in particular, Black women in particular, Carrie Langston and Mary Dillard, who both lived and grew up in Lawrence, both graduated about the same time from Lawrence High School, and also were very active in the temperance movement, club movement, in their own right, were just very impressive women pushing for not just women's rights and the voting rights, but also civil rights more broadly. And we will be including their stories in the gallery as well. We have a very large section dedicated to the story of women's suffrage and women's rights. And again, we don't have material culture, sadly, related to these women, but we are going to make sure we tell their stories how we can through images and through their voices, since they were both such prolific writers as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's so fascinating because, as you were talking, one of the things I was thinking about, was, wow, what made you decide to do a dugout and how does one do that? So I'm really excited to see it. So for those of us who are museum professionals in the audience, or even if we're not, but we want to include women's stories, where should we start?
Um, I'll jump off with this one, Sarah. As a researcher, it's really about being very intentional with our work and our research. Um, you're not going to find most of these stories, you're not going to find summarized in some book on Kansas, right? You're going to have to actually set out at the beginning saying, I want to find a different story, and then being very intentional about finding that story. It's not going to be the what I'm calling headliner history. So you're going to have to do it a little bit differently. Sarah, you have any thoughts on this?
I I think that's exactly right. And I mean, Donna Rae, I think, is going to speak later about just some great examples she has done herself on how to go about doing that actual research too. But I think the question itself that we talked about at the beginning, like just asking, looking at these stories and these narratives, particularly ones that tend to be male dominated. There are certain narratives in particular, like military, politics, some kinds of work related to perhaps like railroad farming that have more male dominated stories, or at least are perceived that way. So if you start there and shift the perspective, be intentional, ask that question, was there a woman around? Um, and actually put women at the center of that story, what you end up getting is an even richer story, in my opinion. And the experience I had with this was actually at the Watkins Museum, where I worked previous to coming here, because a story that I'm sure many of us on today are familiar with and perhaps share in museums or in other ways is Bleeding Kansas. It's a big one for Lawrence, and we have every year this annual Quantrill's Raid, Civil War on the Border recognition. And we had a lot of women's stories documented in different ways, but had not been really pulled together to do one of the tours that we had always offered every year. So I put together a tour, like the women's perspective from Quantrill's Raid. And it was fascinating because one of the stories that I shared was about Augusta Sutliff, who was 8 months pregnant the day of the raid, and getting to stand in front of her house that's still there and say, all right, imagine she is running back and forth between her house and this house catty corner while she's 8 months pregnant. And it shifts that story in such an interesting way because you bring forward that perspective. And so that is, I think, how and why when you start to have that intentionality, like Donna Rae said, you can find this other narrative that really complements well maybe what we already know, but you take away something even deeper from it.
I like the piggyback on that a little bit. I think you also have to have, I just realized we have not talked about commitment yet. Commitment to actually telling the story. Even if you do the research, find the stories, you still have to almost consider yourself a rebel, radical. I don't know what the right word is. To be actually stand up and tell that story as well. So, I think that's another thing that you really have to be intentional, look, shift the perspective, and be committed to tell the story.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up because that's a really important point. Kind of got jumped over, so I appreciate that. Yeah. Um, so part of the issue, I think, with this is, especially if we're looking at, territorial Kansas or, those types of things, or just even normal everyday life, right? We're either, as women, too busy, or we don't recognize the historic value of our lives, right? And even convincing modern day women, right, such as myself, or of the value of our experiences is really hard. Like if we wanted to do oral histories on some, recent topic, the women's lib movement, right, or something like that. So, what are some suggestions you have for overcoming this?
Well, one of the things, I think maybe this is more broadly, but can help for this particular question you asked with women, is something we're trying to do this time around with the museum renovation is we really want everyone to see themselves in the museum and or see someone that they know or related to, or they see a story that resonates with them. And to do this, again, has to be intentional. And I think Donna Rae is going to talk about how to actually get to that point. But more broadly, I think it's that intentionality that drives whose stories are we prioritizing and including. And for us, we know that famous Kansans are certainly a draw, and their stories will be plentifully included within the museum this time around. But so will everyday people, because it is both those perspectives that make up the threads of our past and that really help us understand who we are today. And so I think for us, what I would love is, someone comes in and they see that some of the themes that we're grappling with and talking about engaging with this time around, they're themes like community and traditions and adaptation, resilience, pushing for change and passing down these traditions. And so often those are themes where women are not just included, but are often at the center of. And so that I would hope would be a way to say, see, look, your story matters. And we want your stories and we want your stories included. And then that's when I hand off to Donna Rae, who says, and here's how we go about getting your stuff to
And
tell those
here's
stories.
and here's how we go about getting your stuff. Okay. This is like me and Sarah talking in her
It really
office.
is.
Um, well, first off is I don't, my position as a curator here is a little bit different than some of the other ones. I do something that's called active collecting. So those stories, like you said, might not naturally come in. They're not women who are beating down our doors saying, here's my stuff, here's my story. So I am the one charged to, and I love this part of my job, go wandering and find stories and make connections with people. And really, I was speaking with someone at an organization the other day, and it's about creativity. Doing what we call active collecting is determining whose story might not be there, figuring out who might have that story, and then working with them to bring that story in. Um, Angela was one of those people who I've worked with lately. One that I'm working on right now is actually a director. She's a female director of a science organization. I'm not going to say what organization it is until I actually have secured the donation. But so that's a secret, but stay tuned. I don't know. Um, working with them and bringing in that story. So working and determining what objects, what comprehensively we can have, whether it be an artifact plus pieces of paper and photographs. So thinking about actively going out and getting that story and not being passively waiting and hoping that story shows up, because history tells us that that story might not ever show up. So, yeah.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, do I remember a story of you going out to Western Kansas as well and procuring a quinceañera dress?
Oh,
Uh,
yes, I did.
15th
Yes. See,
15th birthday celebration for,
I did.
Mexican and other Latin American cultures. Yeah.
I did. I was doing that in partnership with the previous museum director. We went on a road trip. I love a good road trip, man, and that was a doozy. But yes, in what is part of that process for me, especially, is sitting down and understanding the story, documenting the story, and getting it from their perspective versus what I think that story should be. And that's really the difference, making sure there's some shared authority here, that people making the donation to us are actually really the one telling us about the donation or the object that we're getting.
Yeah. Thank you. So, as we're talking, as I was preparing for this, it was like, wow, sometimes it's easy to forget that women's history as a field only really began in the 1970s, right? So my question to each of you is kind of over the course of your careers, right? What changes have you seen, and how has this affected the museum field?
Hmm.
Because I
Um,
think,
it's
Sarah was talking before, representation really matters. So seeing yourself reflected, in the museum when it is like, oh yeah, my story is important. And so long as women, we haven't seen that representation.
hmm. um, I'm older. I get to go first. So, um, actually, came to the museum history field a little bit later in life. So, but still, I think there's enough distance between Sarah and I that you can almost tell the difference. When I got there, I got my degree from WSU, and we were really excited to get a female professor focused on women's history. And I'm not sure that would create the kind of uproar it did back in the day. And in fact, another uproar happened when we got a Black professor as well at WSU. I was there for a very long time. But anyway, and I think it really speaks to the resources weren't necessarily there when I started in the field. I do a program, I'm teaching Black women about Black women, and I have to remind myself or forgive myself for not knowing some of these women, because they were just starting out in the field or were not acknowledged when I first began history. So history really started changing for me. I think I really was doing the predominant, male perspective of history. But over time, and you can kind of see it in my presentations even, I have a much more expansive view, than I did when I first started out a few years ago. So I don't know.
So,
What about you, Sarah?
so when I started my journey in the museum field back in 2010, it's you would the discussion was certainly different. I mean, in a lot of ways, I did not have we had women, I had women professors. There were women faculty member, and um, certainly had those models for me. But I do remember reading articles at the time in some of my like museum classes about women in museums, particularly with leadership, and how there was still equity that needed to be achieved in that regard. But a class that I remember in particular, and one book out of that class, the class was Finding Women, Gender, and Sexuality in the Archives. And this class continues, and this book that I'll reference here in a second continues to really resonate with me. And it's one that I still use today. The book was called Contesting Archives, Finding Women in the Sources. And it was a series of case studies and tools about how to conduct women's history research. So we read examples about reading against the grain, reading between the lines, and other methods for when women's voices are not recorded in history. But we know they are there, but they weren't recorded. So how do you go about telling those stories? And when I'm looking back at my career, and that is a class, that is a pivotal moment for me that I point to that really shaped me as a scholar, and really helped me give me those tools and the insights and the perspective, really an understanding that yes, I had a lot of role models that were women I could look to, and I was certainly surrounded by a lot of people who were pushing for and advocating for women's history, but it's like knowing that historically we have not always been prioritized and recorded, that there is still so much work to do, and really being intentional, again, using that word, and even perhaps radical at times, to do so. And so then fast forward to today, what I feel really strongly and passionately about is how important it is that I am in a role, in a leadership role, remembering that I was reading about this very thing 14 years ago, that because of not just that I'm a woman, but that I have women's history research, knowledge, and expertise, that I can bring that now to the museum, and how important that is, and that we need those perspectives at every level of museums, and particularly I think at the leadership level, because that is where often we can set that vision and that intentionality.
Yeah, I think, yeah, that's all excellent points. I think one of the things also is not only being a woman, but also being a Black woman in the field. I still do not see many people that look like me in this field, which is, one thing that I've had to deal with. Another thing in terms of that, you mentioned your class. The women's history class that I took helped me become a better researcher, because it did help me read between the lines and see what other ways I could find resources. Whereas, again, if you're doing male-dominated history, you literally just go to a shelf, pick up a book, and everything is summarized for you. You've got to really start digging into the sources to
Mhm.
find the women's stories, which is a totally different perspective. And when I started in the field, even though it was mainly women in this place, I really appreciate working for Sarah, because she is the first executive director that I've worked for, who now at least she gets it when I say something. She knows what I'm talking about. So yeah.
Wonderful. So, we have a question here. Can you talk more about the difference between the female perspective of history and the male perspective of history? I imagine it's more than adding women's narratives to the existing work, like additive.
Who's going
Donna
first?
Rae.
How do you, what is the difference? Repeat the question one more time.
Yeah. Can you talk more about the difference between the female perspective of history and the male perspective of history? I imagine it's more than just simply adding a women's narrative to the already existing story.
I think when you look at history from a women's point of view, this is maybe a really good for instance. I do a presentation called The Women of Brown, and it examines the Brown versus Board case, but I look at it from not amendments in constitutional law, I look at it from a community standpoint, from a social history standpoint. I think women's history allows me to really have more people at the table. It is not just dominated by one perspective. That's the way I feel about it. While war is a very interesting topic to talk about, what happened to the community? I just feel like women's centered history allows more people at the table. I don't know. What do you think, Sarah?
Yeah, well, I wondered if you'd mentioned Women of Brown because that was what came to mind too, and how you really by bringing forward the voices that have been lost for far too long, I just think we have a better understanding of that case. And to your point about community, and what you have, how you have stitched that together literally in a map. I think that is something in particular that is so beneficial for our understanding. And for me, it was prior to really digging into women's suffrage, I looked at the Chautauqua movement, and it was a fascinating way to kind of flip that script as well, and perhaps that's a way to think about this. That women to get onto the platform, this was a cultural movement in the late 19th century, they had so many more barriers to face to get to that point where they were able to actually achieve that. And I was able to track that and to see what it was that what they had to do and the tactics to get to speak from a platform that was for them, but not by them. And you map that onto the women's suffrage story. And again, it's this understanding that when you look at at women's history, the barriers and the challenges that they were undergoing were different than what men had to. And suffrage in particular is a story about power. And how do you convince someone who has power to essentially share that with you? And so those are the themes that I think that really enrich our understanding is when it's not just about adding a woman's voice, it's about understanding what that journey was that they had to undergo.
Yeah, thank you. So, what are some primary source treasures that you all have turned into interpretive gold? And maybe some new, we've talked about a few, material acquisitions that you previewed for us. Were there any others you'd like to share?
In terms of primary resources, what are some of my favorite? Is that what you're asking me? Or
Well, or what are some of the some primary sources that you have used in interpretation for new things?
uh, actually, I, I'm not sure they're like special or fantastical. I think it's the manner in which you use them. So for instance, I'm just going to default back to the Women of Brown because that's the top of the my head. And for of you who wonder what that project was, it was a humanities funded project where we explored the 12 plaintiffs of the Brown case who happened to be African American women. And Valerie, you participated in that research study. But where we started was obituaries. Looking at the women's obituaries gives us, a fullness of their lives and gives us directions to bounce off of. From there, we knew their church, where they worked, what they did. Never discount a good obituary. Census records. I think one of my favorite research projects Sarah gave me was find boxcar communities. And I'm like, what? They're not on your average map. And so, how do you find a boxcar community? Well, I discovered a way to do it through census records. So, and they literally identify these boxcar communities. I think we were talking about it. It's like they're on the tracks, so, and now being able to then take a map and map them out and then use that on display, I think will be really interesting. Sarah, I'm sure you have a couple.
There's one that comes to mind that I'll share, and we gave a tour this morning, so this is fresh on my mind because I just brought this up again. I'm kind of playing with your primary source definition because I'm going to talk about a 1950s red wheat truck. But here, this truck has really taken on a personality of its own in a sense. It's going to be the featured artifact within our new section on farming. And we've had this truck for 20, 30 years. It has been on display in a special exhibit before, but had not been in the permanent gallery last time around. But we made the decision to bring it forward, and in part because what we really wanted to do with the story of farming this time is bring forward the story of community, particularly around the time of harvest. And this truck, as we were talking just even internally, there's stories that so many people were sharing about remembering the line of grain trucks they would see on the road at harvest time, of the staff member who remembers being in his grandpa's grain truck as it was going up to the grain elevator and then getting elevated to dump the grain. So we decided to go ahead and put it in the gallery because of what it symbolizes. Well, how this gets to gold is that when I also got to go out to the Garden City area, not with Donna Rae, but with the Mary Madden, my predecessor in this role, and we were talking with a woman, Lydia Martinez Smith, whose father, Fred Martinez, was the first Mexican American to own his own farmland in Finney County. And we were talking to her to get more of the story of her father. And through that, also a donation of some sugar beet hoes that he had and used when he was a boy, which is great. And we're excited to have those as well. But then she says that she remembers that the first family vehicle that they owned was this wheat truck. And this would have been about the same period, 1950s, and I about fell out of my chair because I was like, we had already decided we were putting this on display. But hearing the story cemented for me that this is a story of community that stretches throughout the state, throughout, no matter if you're a farmer from Southwest Kansas like Fred Martinez, or you're in Allen County or in Douglas County or Nicodemus, that these are stories that will resonate throughout all communities. And even better, she said she had a photo of her father on the back of his wheat truck and that she donated a copy of it to us. So Fred will be on display in addition next to the wheat truck. And it's those moments and what we're trying to achieve that I think it's so special. And that we're just so excited to have that for so many different areas of the gallery. But that's one of our gold pieces for sure.
I love that story. And so we've been kind of hinting at it a little bit as we've been talking during this time, but I'd be remiss if I did not ask you about the renovations at the museum. What can we expect? What can you tell us?
Sure. So I have kind of talked around this a little bit already, but for those of you who are familiar with the museum, you can probably picture the chronological telling of Kansas history from 13,000 years ago or so through Lewis and Clark trails leading Kansas, train, so on and so on. So this time around, the gallery is going to be structured thematically. And we are using some big ideas and key questions to really help structure that framework for the visitor. So when a visitor walks in, the first question that they'll be encountering and engaging with is this question of what is Kansas? So starting with the present, who are we? What does it mean to be a Kansan? And doing that through a couple of different themes and through kind of talking about how Kansas is this complex place that has a lot of stereotypes that some of them may be accurate, but some maybe not. And we're going to continue to sort of push people to think about that and ask, like, how accurate are these questions? For example, within Bleeding Kansas, this myth of the Free State and this identity that just continues to live so large, at least for those of us on the eastern side of the state, really, really grappling with that. And so Bleeding Kansas is one of our galleries where we're going to be looking at the territorial era and those themes. Making Kansas is another one where we're talking about how the land and the resources have really helped shape Kansas to what we think of today as this breadbasket wheat state kind of identity. Changing Kansas is probably my favorite one because it has to do with women's suffrage and social reforms and civil rights and how interestingly Kansas has a history of being at the center of a lot of movements that had resonated on the national level, as well as the state and local. And the train is still there. Don't worry. I know it's a question I get a lot. And so the train, the railroad, connecting Kansas and the importance of it. And the final area we're talking about is celebrating Kansas and really celebrating what does it mean to be Kansan. The many traditions and festivals and fiestas, powwows, and celebrations that make up what Kansas is today. So we're really also being intentional about, that's the word of the day, by the way, about building a museum that we can update as we continue to make updates and not wait another 40 years. And we want this to be a dynamic museum that we're really hoping that people feel excited and energized by the stories they do see and want to continue to give and share their stories and their artifacts with us so that we can put them on display and just really have people feel like this is my Kansas. I see myself here.
That sounds amazing. I can't wait for it to open. If people in the chat are like super excited as well. So thank you for all of your good work. And we appreciate you joining us this afternoon and everybody in the audience. I'm going to turn it back over to Julie.
Back. I was so enthralled with the conversation that I couldn't find my audio button all of a sudden. But I just want to thank Donna Rae and Sarah and Valerie for what an incredible conversation. And like all of you, I think on the chat, you probably jotted down some notes. And some of the ones that really struck me is this idea that history is all about showing complexities, especially as we expand who's at the table. And Donna Rae's advice about being intentional about if you're wanting to tell a woman's story, being intentional about what it is that you're trying to find is so incredibly important. And once you do find it, having the courage and the confidence to share it and to share it, in your museum or among your community of peers or whoever it is that's appropriate. And I think that just sort of that advice extends beyond the museum community, right? It sort of extends into our personal lives. I know for those of you who, will be around family over Thanksgiving, it's a great time to talk to the women in your family about kind of telling those stories. One of the things that I think both Donna Rae and Sarah, as well as Valerie, alluded to is this idea that women are often the story keepers of our heritage as well. And so tapping into those resources, this is exactly the right time to be doing that. So I want to thank you all for prompting us in that direction here. So, Sarah, it looks like there is a question about whether a website. So if there's
Yes.
something that you might want to share real quick before we end.
What I will suggest is follow us on our social media. That is one of the best ways to get those real-time updates of our progress. We have a social media, Facebook, Instagram for the Kansas Historical Society, but we also have one for the Kansas Museum of History. So find us on both. Give us a follow. However, I'd also recommend if you are not already subscribed to, sign up to get a free copy of our bi-monthly newsletter, The Zephyr. That gives a great overview of what we're doing broadly at the Historical Society, but we have had numerous features on the museum renovation within that newsletter. So it's free. You can get an online version or a mailed version. But if you visit our website, which is kshs.org, that's how you can sign up.
Great. Thank you, Sarah. And that's Zephyr, Zephyr, and it's a great magazine. So thanks for bringing that up. So otherwise, on behalf of Humanities Kansas, we want to thank everyone who joined us today for being part of the movement of ideas. The Big Idea takes a slight recess during the month of December, and then we'll be back in January. So you'll want to sign up for our e-news at humanitieskansas.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram, and you'll get the next lineup for our next season that begins in January. And with that, I want to tell everybody thank you, and thanks extra again to our guests, and have a great rest of your day. See you next year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.